Thank you, Graham. Lots and lots of thought-provoking things there. And I hope that's made it right for some great questions at the end of the session. I'd like to now call up our last speaker for the day, and that would be Siew, and he's going to present a parliamentary perspective on activism.
Well, good evening, everyone. First off, I would like to thank the three of them in front, Peachy, Jolene, and Mark, for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. I'd like to thank all of you for turning up. It's always good to be the last speaker and to stand between 100-odd people and dinner, but I'll try and make it worth your while. The topic of my short presentation is on the title is A Parliamentary Perspective on Activism. And I think some might very fairly ask, who am I to talk about that? Because what laws have I changed in my 2.5 years in Parliament? I think that's a very fair question, and actually that's kind of one of the first things that came to my mind, because I was telling, I think it was Jolie, when they first proposed the topic, I was like, that's kind of like, because there's something about how activism and all, I was thinking, well, I'm going to be on the same stage as Dana and Brema, so that's kind of like teaching your grandmother how to suck eggs. But it's really teaching seasoned activists, talking about activism when I'm on the same stage as very seasoned activists who've been doing this for a lot longer than I have. But at the same time, I think I've tried my best to do what I can when I was in Parliament. I think I like to think I've gained some insight into some of this. So I just want to share that with this audience. I think the starting point has to be the political realities in Singapore, right? And you can't run away from it. And very quickly, basically the PAP runs the country, right? It's overwhelming control of Parliament, 82 elected MPs out of 84 elected MPs, one NCMP and 9 NMPs. And actually, that overwhelming control will not change with the new system, where you have up to 9 NCMPs. Especially in a system with such overwhelming control, coupled with a very, very strict and effective party whip on the PAP, what you end up with is really a system where the ruling party can do whatever they want. They can pass whatever laws they want, whenever they want. Right? And in that, I think for a complete picture, I should also point out, they have the support of Singaporeans. 2006 elections, they polled 66.6%. So, whatever your feelings about the PAP, I think it's a fair and accurate statement to say that the majority of Singaporeans do still support them. So in this context, right, of overwhelming control by a single party, what is the role of activism? What can activists do? What can citizens who want to make a change do? My starting point when I think about that is actually to look at it in terms of service provision against advocacy. Right? So when I say service provision, that's really welfare services, social services, right? Your VWOs, right? People who provide counseling, helplines, counseling services, things like that. And when I think of advocacy, I would look at it in terms of changing the law, right? You're advocating a position, and very often, if not always, the end game of that is to try and effect a change in the law. And when I see these two kind of buckets of activism, I actually see it in advocacy as addressing the root cause of the problem, as being closer to addressing root causes. Because when you want to change the law, I think the underlying assumption there is that changing the law should fix or go a long way towards fixing the problem that you're concerned with. And that's not to downplay the importance of service provision, because that actually brings a very direct impact and makes a very real difference to people's lives. So I think the two are important, right? Two are important, but you need to have both for balanced kind of approach to activism. Now, coming back to the government, I think it's pretty clear to observers and to people who actually have a longer view of history that the PAP government the government's attitude towards advocacy and public pressure is that they would rather not have so much of it. So when you talk about active citizenry, right, it's always about volunteerism. It's all in the service provision space, doing more for the community, doing more for people around you, things like that. It's not about advocacy. That's why the government uses the term civic society, not civil society. Subtle difference, but I think that that attitude towards advocacy is what underpins that language. And that is also why the government is not in favor of arguments and advocacy coming from a rights-based framework. We are talking about human rights, which is what no to rape is about. Right? No to rape is about the right of a woman to choose when she has sex, with whom she wants to have sex. It is all about rights. And of course, this is something that the government, for reasons we can speculate about, but best known to themselves, are not so sympathetic towards rights-based arguments. Some other examples, right, other than no to rape. We had 377, which some quarters would feel that it's not about rights. But we also have things like Project Humane Transport. We also have migrant workers issues, right? And these are about migrant workers' rights. And for some reason, migrant workers' rights migrant workers is seen as a political issue that a lot of people don't want to touch, right? Maybe it's because of maids, foreign domestic workers touch a lot of people's lives, so the government doesn't want to get in the way of that, or doesn't want to be seen to be making Singaporeans' lives harder. Or maybe it's that construction workers have a very direct impact on companies' bottom lines, and so maybe the government doesn't want to enforce migrant workers' rights more for fear of alienating business owners. But I think that attitude can be identified, that there's a general lack of that the government in general would not encourage more advocacy and rights-based approaches. And on that note, I want to talk about an article I saw a couple of weeks back. It was in the Sunday Times on the 26th of July, when our former DPM, Tony Tan, this small little article, but it covered a speech that he made at some events. And this was when Tony Tan was talking about responsible advocacy, right? So he recounted an incident where Mr. S. Tiwari, who's a retired, very senior legal officer in the service, he was then the pro tem president of the Hindi Society. And Tony Tan recounted an incident where S. Tiwari went to him and made a case for Hindi to be taught in schools. I think this was in 1989, right? And the way the former DPM described it is that came to me, he set a meeting, came to me, made a case for it, very calm, very reasonable. And as a result, later in that year, MOE announced a change in the language policy. Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi, and Urdu were added as second languages. And I want to quote a very specific quote that he had, which was, quote, "This form of responsible advocacy exhibited by the Hindi Society in resolving the issue of Hindi education in Singapore could, in my view, be usefully studied by other minority groups in Singapore who are seeking to advance their legitimate interests," unquote. So that's how the government likes activists and advocacy to be done responsibly, right? I mean, for me, I have some issues with that, and firstly, it assumes that advocacy should be left to those with access to decision makers. S. Tiwari was a very senior legal officer, so he had access to important people. I think for the vast majority of Singaporeans, we don't have such access, and I have no such access, just like the rest of humanity.